I didn't say a word when they slid that eviction notice across the table. Not one. I just reached into my folder and pulled out a document older than any of them. An original 1923 water rights deed signed in faded ink. I placed it in front of them, leaned back in my chair, and watched their smug expressions falter. They thought they were about to crush me with bureaucracy, but they had no idea what they were stepping into. With one stroke of the pen nearly 100 years ago, my great-grandfather had secured water rights that outlived towns, councils, and even counties. And now, 35 McMansions were about to discover what it meant to build their paradise downstream from an Army engineer. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 34 years old, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a proud officer of the Army Corps of Engineers. But most importantly, I'm the 3rd-generation owner of 47 acres of Texas land just outside Austin. Land that has been in my family since my grandfather, Pops, bought it back in 1955. Back then, Austin was a sleepy college town where barbecue smoke filled the air and ranchers knew each other by name. Pops was the kind of man who treated land like it was alive. He believed in protecting it, nurturing it, and making sure it could provide not just for us, but for every neighbor who depended on its resources. In 1978, Pops did something that would define the future. He built a modest earthen dam on the back part of our property. Nothing extravagant, no towering concrete structure, just solid, reliable engineering. That dam collected rainwater for our cattle, kept the soil fertile, and most importantly, supplied a steady flow to our downstream neighbors during dry spells. Pops didn't cut corners either. He worked hand in hand with the Army Corps of Engineers, meaning the structure carried federal jurisdiction. That detail might not sound like much now, but years later, it would become the weapon Maggie Thornwell never saw coming. Pops used to tell me, "Jake, one day these back 40 acres will be worth something. But remember, it's not just about what it's worth in dollars. It's about what it's worth in trust. The water, the soil, the neighbors, they're counting on you." I never forgot those words. But life has a way of pulling you away from home. I enlisted, deployed twice to Afghanistan, and found myself working on projects most people back here could never imagine. In a war zone, water isn't just life, it's survival. I learned how to manage flow, calculate supply, and keep entire villages alive with just a pump and a well. Those years taught me 2 things. Water is the most valuable resource on Earth, and people will fight harder for it than for anything else. While I was away, Pops passed. It hit me harder than any mortar round, but I was half a world away and couldn't even be there to say goodbye. The land went into a trust, managed by my sister Sarah. Now Sarah is smart, kind, and good-hearted, but she lives in California, and Texas land law might as well be written in a foreign language to her. She hired a local management company to keep up the taxes, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. But she never checked the details of those tax assessments, and that one small mistake opened the door for predators. And that's where she walked in. Margaret Thornwell, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Maggie, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She was 52 years old, drove a pearl-white BMW, and treated tennis skirts like professional attire. Maggie had that sugary southern drawl that could make you believe she was paying you a compliment even as she was twisting the knife. Married to City Councilman Rick Thornwell, she had power, influence, and a long history of pushing out anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. She'd forced out retirees, strong-armed small farmers, and pressured families into selling their land, just so she could expand her HOA empire. And while I was serving my country overseas, Maggie decided my family land was her next conquest. By the time I came home in August of 2023, the damage had already begun. I drove down that gravel road expecting to see rolling pastures, oak trees, and Pop's little dam sparkling in the Texas sun. Instead, I found something that made my stomach churn. Construction crews, concrete trucks, survey stakes stabbing into the soil like an invasion force. The back 40 acres weren't pastures anymore. They were turning into a subdivision. Willowbrook Estates was building its crown jewel, and they had the audacity to do it on my land. I marched up to the foreman, dust clinging to my boots, and demanded answers. He barely looked up from his clipboard. "Sorry, buddy. We've got permits and everything. This is Willowbrook Estates property now." The arrogance in his voice was like a slap. Moments later, I heard the whir of a golf cart, and there she was, Maggie herself, sitting smug behind the wheel, sunglasses perched on her nose. Her tone was sweet as honey, but laced with venom. "Your family abandoned this land, soldier boy. We're just putting it to good use for the community." But then I saw it. And that's when the real anger hit me. Her crews had diverted the creek, the same creek that fed Pop's dam. The water level was dropping every single day, and with it, 45 years of stewardship. 45 years of carefully balanced flow that had helped neighbors through droughts and floods alike. She wasn't just stealing dirt. She was bleeding life out of the land. I stood there in that heat, the smell of diesel exhaust in my lungs, listening to her parting words. "You should have stayed closer to home, soldier boy." That's when I knew this wasn't just about property, it wasn't even about money, this was war. I thought hiring a lawyer would be my first step, but that turned out to be a rookie mistake. The man I spoke to wanted $85,000 just to challenge the zoning changes. $85,000 just for paperwork, while I was still unpacking my bags from Afghanistan. Turns out, while I was serving my country, Maggie's husband, Councilman Rick Thornwell, had slipped through an emergency zoning modification. Just like that, our agricultural land was transformed into a residential development zone. Conflict of interest? That doesn't even begin to cover it. Rick wasn't just changing maps, he was laying the groundwork for his wife's empire, one corrupt stroke at a time. But if Afghanistan had taught me anything, it was that victory doesn't always come from brute force. It comes from details. The devil hides in paperwork the same way IEDs hide in dirt roads. So, while my overpriced attorney shuffled papers and billed hours, I drove down to the county courthouse. I spent days digging through dusty records, drinking bitter courthouse coffee, and chasing signatures through decades of archives. And then, buried in the yellowing pages of 1978, I struck gold. Pops hadn't just built that dam on his own. He'd built it under direct federal guidance with the Army Corps of Engineers. That meant one thing: federal jurisdiction. And here's your first knowledge nugget. Any dam built with federal oversight cannot be overruled by local HOAs, not now, not ever. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth when I realized what I was holding. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was federal, and that meant Maggie and Rick had picked a fight way above their pay grade. But fate wasn't done handing me ammunition. As I kept flipping through those dusty binders, I stumbled across another document, older than Pops's dam by more than 50 years. A 1923 water rights deed. My great-grandfather had purchased senior water rights to Willow Creek, the same creek Maggie's crews had illegally diverted. These rights were older than the city of Austin, older than the county's water system, and older than every single one of those shiny new houses they were trying to build. It hit me then. Maggie wasn't just stealing land, she was stealing my family's water. Meanwhile, Maggie was hard at work spinning her web of lies. She staged an emergency HOA meeting, complete with a local news crew she'd tipped off. I watched on the evening broadcast as she stood in front of her manicured lawn, crocodile tears glistening on her cheeks. "We're just concerned about the children's safety," she sniffled. "That old dam looks ready to burst and our families are living right downstream." The local anchor nodded solemnly, clearly too lazy to check the facts. If he had, he would have found that my dam had passed its most recent safety inspection with flying colors. But Maggie knew the truth didn't matter, as long as the cameras captured her performance. She didn't stop there. She logged into the Nextdoor app, that digital soapbox where HOA presidents spread gossip like wildfire. Without naming me directly, she described an unstable veteran in the area who was causing disputes and endangering the community. She didn't have to mention my name. In a town that small, everyone knew who she meant. Overnight, I went from decorated engineer to whispered about troublemaker, the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. The harassment campaign escalated quickly. Her so-called neighborhood safety patrol, 3 HOA board members in matching polo shirts, started parking at the entrance of my property like it was some kind of suburban checkpoint. They took photos of my visitors, wrote down license plates, and called the sheriff to report suspicious activity. My old farmhouse, which had stood since 1962, suddenly became a target for endless citations. Unsightly structures, septic issues, noise complaints every time I turned up the radio while working. Each fine was another stone thrown, meant to break me down. The cruelest blow came when Rick abused his city council position to order a wellness check on me through Veteran Services. The report labeled me a troubled veteran who might be struggling with adjustment issues. One morning, a social worker showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, while Maggie watched smugly from her golf cart like a general inspecting her troops. That wasn't just harassment. It was humiliation, designed to paint me as unstable and dangerous. But here's where their arrogance turned into my weapon. I picked up the phone and called an old Army buddy, Tony Riggs. Tony now worked for the EPA's Enforcement Division, and in just 20 minutes on the line with him, I learned more about environmental law than I ever did from that expensive lawyer. "Jake," Tony told me, "if they're diverting a natural waterway without federal permits, that's a violation of the Clean Water Act. And since your dam was built under federal oversight, that puts them in serious trouble." From that moment on, I documented everything. I installed trail cameras around my property. I took time-stamped photographs of the diverted creek. I measured water flow at 3 different points every day, tracking the slow death of Pops's dam. I built a case, brick by brick, the way I'd built defenses overseas. And as I worked, I found allies. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had watched her family's garden wither ever since the creek was diverted. Miguel Santos, another neighbor, had lost his family farm to one of Rick's shady rezoning maneuvers 2 years earlier. Both of them had been fighting Maggie alone, but when we joined forces, the picture became clear. This wasn't just about me. This was a systematic land grab. Maggie and Rick had been using the same playbook for years: harassment, zoning tricks, and bureaucratic warfare, to steal land from anyone too small to fight back. Every night I stood on my porch watching the construction crews pour concrete, the smell of diesel and wet cement hanging in the Texas air. Every night I counted the new foundations that didn't belong on my soil, and every night I swore I wouldn't let Pops's legacy disappear under the weight of cinder blocks and false permits. The deeper I dug, the more corruption I uncovered. Their development sat smack in the middle of what the Army Corps classified as a 100-year floodplain. Insurance companies had refused coverage at first, until the HOA claimed they had solved the issue by permanently diverting Willow Creek onto my property. In other words, they'd lied to banks, lied to insurers, and shifted their flood problem onto my land. That isn't just shady, it's fraud. The kind of fraud that can carry criminal penalties. Maggie thought she had me boxed in with gossip, fines, and fake concern. But what she didn't realize was that every lie she told, every corner she cut, and every drop of water she stole was becoming evidence. Evidence I would use to turn her suburban empire into a house of cards. And soon I would be the one pulling the bottom piece. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like soldiers preparing for battle. For weeks I had been restoring Pop's old hydraulic system, gathering allies and collecting evidence. Now, with heavy rain in the forecast and federal investigators on their way, everything lined up. Maggie thought gossip, harassment, and corrupt judges would break me. But she had forgotten one simple truth: water always finds its way home. I treated this like a mission, not revenge. Opening a dam isn't pulling a lever, it's engineering. I planned every step: spillway at dawn, 25% release, gradually increasing until the creek flowed naturally again. Just enough to prove my case without flooding a single home. Safety was the foundation. I posted warnings, notified the fire department, and drew up an evacuation plan I hoped no one would need. This wasn't destruction. This was restoration. I wasn't alone. Amanda Cross, the environmental lawyer, made sure reporters and regulators would witness everything. Tony Riggs, my old Army buddy now at the EPA, guaranteed federal oversight. Miguel Santos and Mrs. Chen brought proof of generational farming tied to the creek. Together, we weren't just landowners, we were a community taking back what was stolen. Maggie's desperation showed. She staged photo ops with worried mothers holding signs near my property. She hired private security in tactical vests, who my trail cameras caught trying to sabotage the spillway with concrete at 2 a.m. Deputies arrested them on the spot, Then she stooped lower, calling veteran services to claim I was suicidal, hoping I'd be dragged off before the gates opened. A social worker arrived just before dawn, clipboard in hand, while Maggie smirked from her golf cart. But I stood steady, calm, and clear. They couldn't break me. At 7:02 a.m., with rain in the air and federal agents watching, I opened the gates. The sound wasn't violent, it was steady and controlled. Willow Creek flowed into its original bed for the first time in 18 months. Neighbors gasped, reporters leaned forward, and Miguel knelt to scoop the clear water into his hands, tears streaming down his face. "This is the water that fed my grandfather's farm," he whispered. Maggie lost her mask in seconds. She screamed that I was a terrorist, shrieking at cameras that I was flooding homes. But there was no flood, just water flowing exactly where it belonged. Reporters pressed her with questions she couldn't answer, and her carefully built narrative collapsed live on camera. The fallout was immediate. State investigators froze the HOA's insurance after Amanda revealed fraudulent applications. Banks demanded repayment on millions in loans. Rick's corruption was caught on tape, screaming into a phone about destroying property values, and his career disintegrated overnight. The empire they built on lies was sinking fast. Still, the courtroom became the true battlefield. Maggie entered dressed as a grieving community leader, backed by high-priced lawyers. I wore Pops's old cowboy hat and a plain shirt. Her attorneys thundered about millions in damages and painted me as an unstable veteran. But Amanda calmly laid out the truth. The 1978 covenant requiring seasonal flooding, EPA testimony that my operation restored natural flow, photographs proving the creek's history. Then came the breaking point. Rick, under oath, admitted to zoning changes pushed while I was overseas and confessed to profiting directly from construction. Amanda played the recording of his furious phone call, and the gallery erupted. Federal prosecutors announced investigations into fraud and environmental crimes right there in the courtroom. When I spoke, I read from Pops's journal. "Opened the spillway today. Helped the neighbors through the dry spell, that's what neighbors do." Then I looked at the judge and said, "I didn't flood anyone. I restored a creek stolen from my family in this community." Silence fell heavier than any verdict. The ruling came swift. My operation was legal. The HOA was barred from interfering. Federal agents swarmed Maggie and Rick's dealings. Within months, Rick was sentenced to prison, Maggie bankrupt, and the Willowbrook HOA dissolved. What rose in its place wasn't just restored land, it was restored community. Miguel got his farm back. Mrs. Chen's garden bloomed again. The creek became a sanctuary, drawing kayakers, bird watchers, and families instead of bulldozers. And Pop's name lived on through a conservation trust, ensuring no one could ever steal that water again. Now, every Sunday I bring a mason jar of creek water to Pops's grave. I set it down, smile, and whisper, "She's singing again, Pops, just like you said." Because in the end, it was never about revenge. It was about justice, about neighbors, and about water flowing exactly where it belongs.